Hello and welcome back to Hudson Auto Films. Today we are continuing on the 4x4 Supercar, and what I'm sitting on is our donor chassis. This was, a couple of episodes ago, a fully functional though very rusty Landrover Discovery, and over the last two episodes we've stripped it down into this. I had initially earmarked this episode to restore the chassis. I had intended to take it away, pressure wash it, do all the welding that's needed. There's not a huge amount, but there's certainly a few areas that need attention. Paint it, look at suspension, bushes, all that sort of thing. However, after thinking about it, I realised that's probably not the right order of events. The process of putting the Aston body on is going to be quite rough. We're going to have to move it around a lot, lift it up, put it down, and ultimately it's going to scratch the chassis. We're going to need to maybe cut parts of the Aston out. So presenting a perfect chassis and then trying to do quite a labour intensive and aggressive isn't the right word, but intense task, is just going to damage the work we would have done. So it seems sensible to figure out how the Aston body is going to sit, get it mounted for the first time so we know exactly how everything is going to work. Then once the body's removed again, take the chassis away, do the welding and present a beautiful chassis when we know exactly where the Aston body is going to sit and how it's going to sit. So in today's episode, I'm going to clean this down a little bit so it's a bit nicer to have in the barn. I'm then going to remove the last bit of bulkhead, the steering and the pedals, and then we'll strip down the Aston body, and hopefully by the end of this episode, we will have the Aston body just lightly sitting on this, so we'll have the first look at a rough idea of what this might look like. A very, very rough idea, but that is the goal, to have the Aston body just sitting on this by the end of today. So enough talk, let's pull this into the barn. Well, that was slightly sketchy. Something was bound to go wrong at some point, and thankfully it wasn't too bad. Let me show you what just happened. So if I take you around the front, as you can see, there is lots of wires, which were all propped up here. I've moved them now. This wire here got caught on the wheel, and the wheel dragged it round, which then yanked the wiring harness through the car, pulling the bulkhead down, which then ripped off the fuel line there, and fuel squirted out, and obviously the engine went crazy revving. And yeah, but thankfully, other than a broken fuel line, everything is remarkably okay. And even more importantly, the motorbike that is in front of the car did not get hit, nor did we drive straight through the barn. So overall, it could have been worse. But in a way, this has done part of the work for us, because now we need to remove everything that is holding this bulkhead in. The bulkhead itself is actually being held in by one bolt, which you can kind of see just in there if I zoom in. But everything else that is connected is fuel filter, brake booster, the steering is connected, obviously all the wiring is connected. So now we need to remove everything that holds this thing together. And then we'll have a completely exposed chassis, and then it is time to strip the Aston and put the body on. Okay, I think everything is undone apart from the bolt which actually holds the bulkhead in. But I think it's quite rusty, so I'm just going to pull and see if it goes. So let's see. Okay, so that was a bit of an ordeal, but we got there in the end. It really was hanging on by a thread, but it put on a good fight. I've got to cut a few little bits off which are hanging on from remnants of the body, but I'm not going to do that on camera as it's boring. But one thing I do want to do is I want to see if the car will still start. For a long time it's had this kind of hot wired setup, so I want to see if that is still functioning. So I'm going to attach the fuel line again, attach a battery and see if we have any life still. Well, that was really cool. So literally removing all of this did absolutely nothing. All of that wiring, etc. And the car still seemed to run fine. Obviously, it goes without saying all of that wiring is vitally important if you want to have a Land Rover Discovery 1 which works and has lights and all of that sort of thing, but it's still really interesting that it's not needed to make it run well. Thinking about the build and how I want it to be, I do want it to be incredibly simple. So maybe someone in the comments could tell me what is the minimum a Land Rover actually needs to run correctly. Obviously with the modern car, when you take away wiring, it starts to run incorrectly, but as far as I know, the Discovery 1 didn't have a kind of engine functions ECU. It had an alarm ECU and a locking ECU, but I don't think it needs a computer to run correctly. Obviously it started running just now and it sounded as it has always sounded. Maybe someone in the comments could tell me who knows about Discovery 1s, whether it is okay literally to run it from a direct start setup. Obviously, I know I need things like lights, etc., but those can easily be wired in a really simple way. It'd be nice to have a completely simple car, you know what I mean? No flim flam. Obviously, it's not going to be a luxurious vehicle by any stretch, so it's not like we need to retain much. So the more simple we can get things, the better. Anyway, the sun is setting, so I think I'm going to take advantage of this and I'm going to try and do a little bit of stripping on the V8 Vantage body, and we'll continue it through tomorrow anyway, so let's see what we can get done. Okay, so that is a more or less fully stripped Aston Martin V8 Vantage. There are a few small bits hanging on, but nothing major. All of the major components have been removed, and importantly, all of the things which would potentially obstruct the next stage, which is resting on the Land Rover chassis, have been removed. I had hoped to get some friends to help me lift it, but I'm struggling to rally up 8 people to help me lift it, so I'm going to attempt to put it on a dolly and roll it close and somehow leverage it onto the chassis on my own. So let's see how this goes. Well, I bet you've never seen school chairs hold up an Aston Martin. That actually was a lot easier than I thought. It was a bit tricky getting it to the height I needed, but once the dolly was underneath it, it dragged relatively easily. I was a bit concerned that the wheels would get stuck in the ground, but we've had a heat wave, so it's pretty solid ground right now, so that's good. So it is now at the door. It is finally facing the Landrover, which it will become one with. And now the easy part is out the way. Inevitably, this is going to be the hard bit. My plan is basically to drag the car on the dolly as close to the back of the Landrover as possible, lift it up so I can then kind of slide it onto the Landrover a little bit, and then slowly drag the Aston onto the Landrover. When a portion of the weight is taken, it's very easy, as you probably saw in the previous time lapse, for me to lift it up and down. So yeah, it's just a case of how easily can I get the majority of the body onto the Landrover before I need to start lifting to get over engines and stuff like that. But other than that, I guess we just have to get stuck in and see how this goes. Well, that was quite an ordeal. I am kind of amazed that I managed to get it on my own. As I mentioned before, I had intended to get about 8 people to help me, so I had to go about and do it in a very slow, sketchy, and probably totally inefficient way, but it is on. Let me turn it around and we'll go over the good, the bad, and what we need to do next. This is pure idiocy. It's brilliant. As you can tell, the car is not sitting anywhere near where it needs to be sitting. Obviously, the wood is still in place, which is what we're going to remove next, which is stopping the body going lower. We've got all of that gap there, which needs to go down. But quickly talking about the good elements, if we take you to the engine bay, the amount of clearance is remarkable. The gearbox sits in the tunnel very well. We've got quite a lot of space actually behind the engine as well. Obviously, this engine is so much smaller than the Aston V8. And our front body mounts sit more or less in line with the rails. Obviously, it goes without saying, this is not remotely precise where things need to be. The car currently is sitting on a massive angle that way, and it's also folded that way because of the height of the plywood. So we need to get it lower. But the front of the car is excellent. There's clearance where it needs to be. The gear stick is about here, so that's easy to cut out and remedy. We'll obviously just have to, that's further down the line, but yeah, the back is where it was always going to be more complicated. The plywood kind of gives us a better look. So if you look here, we've got this recessed area, which is important. And then if you look here, we've got this higher area on the Land Rover chassis. They're pretty close to where they need to be. In a perfect world, that piece of the Land Rover chassis would have slotted perfectly in there. I do think we're definitely going to have to do some cutting on that area of the Aston to get it to sit properly, but that's fine. This was never meant to go on this chassis, if you couldn't already tell. Obviously, there's lots of ways we could go about it. We could just bolt it up and kind of level it and have it sitting as high as it is now, and it'd be somewhat like the gimmicks they did on Top Gear and the Grand Tour. However, that's not what I'm going for. I know this car is inherently gimmicky, but I would like it to sit so it looks at its optimum and it looks cool and doesn't just look like you've just stuck it on. Another thing is the wheels look far too small. We are going to get some big wheels for this, as you'd expect, to fill up these arches. And we might have to do kind of extended wheel arches and all this sort of thing and spacers, but it is all part of the fun and the process. But overall, I'm very pleased. I'm kind of amazed that I got it on still, but I'm very impatient, so I want to remove that plywood right now so we can get an even better idea on what is next. So there we have it. I hope you can see that it's sitting a lot better than it was. It's still about 6 inches out of where it needs to be, but that's what we need to talk about now. So it seems very logical that we use these two body mounts and that they go into the sills. So that is where we need to get to. Like we talked about earlier, the main area which is obstructing is where this major chassis component hits the floor of the Aston. And that is basically the main area on the rear which is stopping the Aston reaching those body mounts. So what we're going to do is basically just cut as little as we can out of this area, and then luckily the whole chassis kind of goes upwards. Hopefully by removing the corners of the floor here, it'll allow it to slide down over here. As you can see, that is the area of rust we need to address when we restore the chassis. But that should basically allow the rear end to drop more or less exactly where we need it to be. The part right now which is supporting the front is literally this portion of the Aston body resting on the remnants of the front body mount here. But obviously by removing the portion of the back and going down as much as 6 inches, we're going to have trouble because this is going to hit and then the back will be sitting way lower than the front. So I'm thinking we'll probably have to remove this portion of the Aston so it can sit lower and then address a body mount further back, as this is just not going to work. There's also not enough surface area for this body mount to safely bolt into anything. So yeah, we'll cut probably this front portion off so it can sit lower. But the lower we go, the more things hit. So as you can see, that portion of the gearbox, though right now it is sitting very comfortably, that's probably only got about 2 inches of clearance. So we'll have to remove a portion of the tunnel, which is fine. And obviously when we're that much lower, the gear sticks, which you can see kind of living in there. So obviously we'd be cutting out a portion here regardless to allow the gear selectors to come through. Because we've got this issue around here, I think it might be sensible to cut a larger portion out so the whole gearbox has the right amount of clearance, and then we can basically create a new piece which fits over and houses everything. The reduction of 6 inches in height will bring this to kind of roughly where it needs to be. And obviously the body line of the rear arch will then sit a huge amount better. I mean, it's still very high, but you can kind of imagine it will be more like here. That paired with bigger wheels will be closing the gap. Another area that will be just, I think, too difficult is the top of the radiator and this support. The distance between these two is about 5.5 inches, so we might get lucky depending on how everything sits, but realistically, I think we're going to have to remove this portion and re-brace it using another method. And I'm sure with all the creation stuff we'll have to do in the front to house things like this, because sitting on wood will be no good. It'll be no problem to make a more suitable support. But other than that, those are our clearance issues. So I'm kind of amazed and very pleased that we don't actually have to deal with too much at all, and certainly a lot less than I thought we would. And for those of you who are concerned about removing portions of the Aston body, I don't think you have to worry. I'm not concerned for two reasons. First of all, obviously, if you were doing this to an Aston in its proper form when it remained a monocoque chassis, that would be idiotic. The whole thing would become incredibly dangerous because it needs to be complete. However, because we're bolting it onto this and it's becoming a body on chassis design, you gain so much rigidity from putting it onto the Landrover chassis. I don't say it rules it out, but it changes the whole dynamics of everything. So removing parts of the Aston body isn't really going to impair the rigidity because it's gaining so much rigidity by going the Landrover chassis. However, the things that are concerning me at this very moment are mounting the body. Obviously, when it was a Land Rover, it was using the two body mounts here, which we will be using, and it also had the two at the front, it had two at the back, and a couple of kind of mid ones. However, due to placement, we obviously can't use the two at the back because they don't actually reach anything sturdy. And we've established that we need to cut away here for clearance reasons, so that rules out the front mounts. We will be able to retain these two smaller ones, which were basically seatbelt anchors, so that's good, but ultimately those are not the most sturdy mounts. But we will be able to use the most aggressive mounts, you could say, the four major body mounts. However, something on my mind is that obviously these were going into the steel body. In fact, that is a portion of the steel body still attached. Whereas in this case, it will be going into aluminium. This is a completely aluminium body on the Aston. Aluminium is a lot softer, so I'm a bit concerned how safe that would be. So right now I'm kind of playing with the idea of cutting a small hole in the end of the sill, running a steel beam through the length of it, which has nuts welded to it, which we can then bolt through into in multiple places and probably even a brace across here. So we have a little bit more of a solid anchor. Not to mention having a beam running through would spread the pressure. If we just had a bolt going through, it would give us a very small surface area and that would not be safe. However, I would definitely feel a lot more comfortable with probably another 4 mounting points. So that's something we need to look into. The issue with that is you're not meant to modify the chassis at all in order for this to be road legal in the UK. You can put anything on top of it, but the second you modify the chassis, that is something different and that needs to be put through loads of tests and that sort of thing. So I need to look more into the details of that, because in my head, that makes perfect sense if you're removing portions of the chassis, but this would be adding portions, adding body mounts, adding rigidity. So it wouldn't make any sense for that to be an issue, but just knowing how, driving standards agencies work, it probably will be. So there's something we've got to look into, because 4 major mounts and 2 smaller mounts doesn't quite sit right for me, especially with the aluminium taken into consideration. But we'll figure it out. We'll always get there, but overall it's been incredibly successful. And I'm still shocked at how well this has all come together and how little cutting we're going to have to do on the Aston body. On the chassis front, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, that is going to have to be restored at a later date. However, I don't claim to be the world's most fantastic welder. I will do it if I have to do it, but if there's anybody who's watching who welds professionally or has a company who deals in chassis restorations who would like to partner in some sort of way, depending on how well these videos do, maybe that would be something that one of you would consider. I'd love to get involved, because that would make my life a lot easier. But there we have it. We are well on the way to creating what I think, and I'm fairly sure, is the world's first 4x4 Aston Martin Landrover Frankenstein thing. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I've had a great time making it and I'm really enjoying this series. It's been really nice to do something just for the fun of it. I do love restorations, but that's a very different sort of process, whereas this is purely just fun. And I hope you can understand that. I'm not going for the off-road land speed record or even trying to create something that is highly functional. It's just fun. And sometimes that is all cars should be. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, subscribe, all that YouTube stuff. It really does help me keep making these videos, helps more people see them, and yeah, we can keep cracking on with this thing. If you'd like to support the channel further, there is a link below to my Patreon, where I post content more or less every day, behind the scenes, pictures of what's going on, uncut videos, and basically you get to see everything a few weeks before you get to see it on YouTube. But regardless, I'm just happy you're here. Thank you again so much, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.